All right, so we're back for another deep dive into these JFK files. And as you know, we're using AI to sort through this massive collection. This time, we're taking a look at files 51 to 100.
Yeah, we're still pretty early on in this whole thing, right? I mean, we've got over 2,000 files to go.
Over 2,000, 2,182 to be exact. And the thing is, the way these files are named, it's really hard to know what we're going to find in each batch. Sometimes it feels kind of random, even for us.
Totally. It's like we're opening up these boxes in a giant unlabeled archive. We can tell you what's in each box, in this case, each file. We can even point out if we see the same thing popping up over and over again.
Right, or if something really catches our eye.
Exactly. But as far as the big picture, the connections between all these things, that's something that'll hopefully become clearer as we process more of these files. And remember, we're AI, so we're just looking at the words in these documents.
We're not historians, we're not analysts.
Right, we're just your guides through this information. We're just showing you what's there.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're going to focus on those 50 files, 51 to 100, and see what we can piece together. Even if some of the documents seem totally unrelated, we'll try to give you a complete picture of what they contain. So let's get started. Going through these files, one thing we notice right away is a lot of information about people. We're talking lists of names, addresses, phone numbers all over the place.
Yeah.
Files like 104, 10062, 1005. Actually, a bunch of others too. What do you think about that?
Well, the interesting thing is there's a definite pattern in these personnel lists, a geographical connection. We see a lot of names linked to Tokyo, Japan, people like Tadatoshi Zumoto, Tom Zumoto, Masaki Nagai. There's even mentions of assignments to the Soviet section of Tokyo Station. What does that tell you?
It sounds like Tokyo is a pretty important spot for intelligence gathering, probably because of where it is right next to the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
You got it. It was a key location, maybe a major listening post, or even hub for operations.
Makes sense. Keeping an eye on what the Soviets were up to in Asia would have been a top priority back then. But then there are all these other lists of contacts too. Ann Egerter, Gunnar Beckman, Ray Swider, and it's not so clear what their connection is to a specific place or operation. Makes you wonder what these lists were for.
Right. It's a really good question. What were they keeping track of these names for? Were these like internal phone books or contacts related to operations that just aren't described in detail in these particular files?
Or just general intel gathering.
Could be. The point is they were recording these names for a reason. These people were of interest to the agency somehow, even if we don't know exactly why yet. It's like a glimpse into their information gathering process. They were keeping tabs on a lot of people.
And we also find these little snippets of communication,
Hmm.
memos about phone calls, like one to Shep from a Pat Bente, and another for a Kleiger from a Shirley A. Martin, alias Hope Mason.
Ooh, aliases, intrigue.
Right? They're like little accidental peeks into the daily life of intelligence operations.
They really humanize the whole thing, don't they? You can almost picture these agents making calls, passing information back and forth.
And the fact that Shirley A. Martin was using an alias,
Hmm.
clearly they were being careful,
Mm-hmm.
trying to stay under the radar.
Makes you wonder what they were working on. Then there's this other call to Shep about Y Corp's Security Cheeseboro Foundly line.
What even is that?
No idea. It's not clear at all from this memo, but it does hint at something, right?
Maybe connections to private companies?
Maybe. Or some kind of code name for a project. It's definitely a little mystery for us to try to solve.
Now, we also found some watch lists. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Names like Alvarola Surinok, Ali Khan, and Timucci. Sometimes there were descriptions or even details about their travel. Clearly people who were being, well, watched for some reason.
This kind of thing is pretty standard in intelligence work. They want to know who's going where and why. Could be for counterintelligence, keeping an eye on potential threats, or maybe it's part of a larger investigation. Whatever the reason, they were tracking these people's movements.
Then there's the personnel announcements, transfers, extensions. People like Kenny, Hughes, Ogino, and more. The locations are all over the map. Ankara, Amman, Colombo, New Delhi, Lomé.
It's a reminder of the global scale of this whole thing, isn't it? Agents being moved around constantly.
Probably based on whatever was happening in the world at that time, shifting priorities, new threats.
Absolutely. It shows just how dynamic and complex intelligence work can be. Maintaining this whole network across the globe takes a lot of coordination.
And in one document, 104, 10065, 10152, we get a more detailed look at the internal structure of the CIA during this time. It talks about a reorganization of the Operations Directorate, New positions were created, like the Assistant Deputy Director for Operations for Development.
Oh, and new groups too, right? Like the Special Operations Group and the Counterintelligence
Sounds
Staff.
like they were doubling down on those areas.
I think you're right. It probably reflects the changing times, the growing need to deal with new kinds of threats. And there's the information services staff, too, which makes you think about how important data and information management was becoming.
It's fascinating to see how they were adapting and evolving.
It really is. We get this snapshot of their priorities and how they were organizing themselves to meet the challenges of the day.
All right, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some specific operations and investigations that we see in files 51 through 100. For example, document 104, 1061, 10386 deals with a FOIA Appeal Freedom of Information Act.
Basically, someone was requesting access to certain government documents.
And it seems like they did release some information, but only after sanitizing it. They also sent a name check request over to the Army. And they even talked about downgrading the classification level of some secret documents. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting to see this process in action, right?
Hmm.
The government trying to balance transparency with the need to protect sensitive information.
Yeah, it's a tough line to walk. And it shows that they were reviewing these classified documents, and if they deemed the information not so critical anymore, they might make it more accessible.
Makes sense. The world changes, and so do the secrets they need to keep.
Then there's document 104, 100062, 10062. This one details the contact and debriefing of a guy named Lazaro Eddie Espinoza Bonet back in 1969. It turns out he was involved in some pretty serious stuff related to Cuba.
Like what?
Well, it talks about infiltration missions, his knowledge of explosives, and his connections to anti-Castro groups.
Wow. So this gives us a pretty direct look at the covert actions the U.S. was taking against Cuba during that time.
Exactly. And it also shows the kind of people they were working with, people willing to take risks and potentially put themselves in dangerous situations.
It's a reminder that this wasn't just paperwork and meetings. There were real people on the ground involved in risky operations.
Document 104, 100062, 100073 is a bit different. It talks about a meeting in 1974 with some committee councils about different witnesses and agreements related to the testimonies of Mary Louise McGillen, Robert Ritchie, and Martin Lukoski. Sounds like some kind of official inquiry.
Could be a congressional hearing or some other kind of oversight process. They're talking about witness testimonies and agreements, so it seems pretty formal.
Right. It shows that the CIA wasn't just operating in the shadows. They had to answer to someone, report on what they were doing.
Accountability. It's important, even in the world of intelligence.
Moving on, we have file 104 10063 10017, which outlines a proposed operation with the code name LNE Argo, planned for fiscal year 1971. It focused on the organization of Arab students in the U.S.
Arab students. That's interesting.
Yeah, and they even talked about a trip to the Middle East for some of these students.
Sounds like they were interested in understanding and maybe even influencing these student groups.
And remember, this was during a time of a lot of tension in the Middle East, so it's not surprising that they were paying attention to this.
Makes sense. They wanted to know what these students were thinking, who they were connected to.
Then we have a bunch of documents, starting with 104 10063 10149, that deal with alleged hijackers. Seems like they were operating in Algeria.
Hijacking was a huge problem back then, and these documents show how seriously the CIA was taking it.
We see requests for information, mentions of specific names like George Lorenzo Matthews and Lindsay O'Neill Holder.
They were trying to track these individuals, understand their movements and intentions, probably working with other intelligence agencies too. It was a real international effort.
File 104 10063 1063 1043 is a bit mysterious. It mentions Operation Morke-ICS, which is described as extremely sensitive and under the control of the Deputy Director for Plans. It also mentions restricted handling channels, so whatever this was, it was top secret.
Yeah, this one definitely raises more questions than it answers. But the fact that they're being so secretive about it tells us it was something important, maybe even dangerous.
Then we have 104 10063 10438, which is a contact report about meetings with MPTR Oika 7 in 1972. They were talking about the United States-China Friendship Association and educational activities.
The U.S. and China were starting to open up to each other at that time, so it's not surprising the CIA was interested in this.
Right. They wanted to understand what was going on, who was involved, what the implications might be for U.S. foreign policy.
It was a major shift in global politics, so they had to pay attention.
Next, there's document 104 10064 1006, which is just a short dispatch about the transmittal of Timothy Leary documents in 1971. Timothy Leary, the counterculture icon, advocate for psychedelic drugs.
Oh, wow. That's a name I didn't expect to see here.
Right, so why were they interested in him?
Well, he was a pretty controversial figure associated with social movements that challenged the status quo. The CIA might have been worried about the impact of these movements, or maybe they were even trying to figure out ways to influence them.
File 104-10064-7010 talks about a Japanese anti-war group called Bahiran and 4 U.S. Navy deserters who were in Japan at the time. It also mentions Rybat M. Fasha Red Top, but it's not clear what that refers to.
Yeah, that one's a head-scratcher. But the focus on Bahiran is pretty clear. They were a major force in the anti-Vietnam War movement in Japan.
And the Navy deserters would have been a huge concern. It's bad for morale, and it creates international incidents.
Definitely something the CIA would want to keep tabs on.
Document 104-1000065-10038 is about Ramon Joseph Alvarez, who was involved in surveillance of the Soviet embassy way back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. There are even code names mentioned: Liempty and the Lyric.
Classic Cold War spy stuff. This shows how long they were focused on the Soviets.
Decades of surveillance using all sorts of techniques to gather information. It was a constant back and forth.
Absolutely, a real intelligence battle.
Then we have 104-10066-10031, which mentions a sensitive source reporting on a guy named Willem Oltmans. It turns out he was meeting with Cuban and Soviet diplomats in 1977. And get this, he was also interested in the death of George de Mohrenschildt.
Wait, George de Mohrenschildt? The guy who knew Lee Harvey Oswald.
The one and only.
Hmm.
So what was the CIA's interest here?
Well, this is getting into some pretty murky territory. We're talking about the JFK assassination and the possibility of foreign involvement.
Right. It seems like they were still looking into these connections even years later.
Makes you wonder what they knew or what they suspected.
Now, for a real taste of what it was like on the ground, check out document 104-1000066-10076. This one describes a 1965 operation to bug an apartment building in Cuba.
Bugging, as in planting listening devices.
Yep. But it didn't go smoothly at all. They had problems with the lease, trouble installing the equipment, and to top it off, 3 of their technicians got arrested.
Wow, that's a disaster.
It really shows how difficult and risky these operations were, especially in a place like Cuba where they were basically enemies.
It's a reminder that intelligence work isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's just messy and dangerous.
File 104-10066-10238 is a simple routing slip for a briefing book about Cuba in 1966, destined for the Director of Central Intelligence.
Clearly, Cuba was a top priority for the agency at that time. The DCI wouldn't need a whole briefing book if it wasn't important.
And finally, we have 104-10067-10291, which discusses operational tradecraft and methods at a station that's likely in Mexico City. It talks about working with liaison partners and the importance of protecting sources.
The lifeblood of intelligence work, those sources, they're everything.
And if their identities are revealed, it could be devastating.
Not just for the source themselves, but for the entire operation.
But this document also mentions something interesting: the political sensitivity surrounding a trip by López Portillo to Moscow.
López Portillo, wasn't he the president of Mexico?
That's right. So this shows how international politics could complicate things. You have to be aware of the bigger picture when you're conducting these kinds of operations.
Absolutely. It's not just about spies and gadgets. It's about understanding the political landscape and navigating those complexities.
Okay, so let's step back and try to make sense of all this. What have we learned from these 50 files? Well, we've seen a glimpse into a huge range of intelligence activities: personnel management, surveillance, counterintelligence, international liaison.
The geographical scope is really striking, too. We're talking about operations all over the world, from Japan and Southeast Asia to Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America.
It's a reminder that the CIA's reach was truly global.
And the time frame of these documents is also important. They span several decades, which tells us that some of these efforts went on for a long time.
They weren't just reacting to events, they were engaged in long-term strategic thinking.
Exactly. So while each file might seem like a small piece of the puzzle, when you put them all together, you start to get a much clearer picture of what was happening during this period.
And it's a fascinating picture. It shows the complexity of intelligence work, the challenges they faced, the successes and the failures.
And remember, we're only scratching the surface here. We've still got over 2,000 files to go. Who knows what we'll find as we continue this deep dive?
It's an exciting thought, isn't it? So we encourage you to keep listening, keep exploring these documents with us, and think about the bigger picture, the historical context, the connections between these events, and the people involved.
And most importantly, keep asking questions. What else is hidden in these files? What stories are waiting to be uncovered?
What will we learn next?